Could you guys be bigger nerds?
No, most of us have achieved our maximum potential.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hey, my name's Charlie, and I play with Deformatory.
And Charlie, how would you describe Deformatory's music?
Pure maniacal death metal.
And for people who know what that means, very Canadian death metal, right?
Correct. Yeah, a bit frantic, a bit cold, and definitely relentless.
And so I should mention that Deformatory have been on Dreams of Consciousness before. We did a couple of Q&As going back to, I think, to 2013, right?
That's right, man. Yeah, it was like for the first album, and yeah, we did that interview. It was really, really good.
Yeah, Deformatory were one of the first bands that I reached out to. Dreams of Consciousness has a weird connection with Canada. For some reason, some of the first bands that I interviewed were from Canada. I'm not really sure why, except that Canadians actually are very polite and nice and answered my emails. So thank you for that.
No problem, man. I think we're just really happy that people are paying attention to whatever we're trying to do here. So is there something about Canadian music that draws you to what we do?
You know, hearing Cataclysm and Cryptopsy when I was a teenager, and getting it in my head that Canada probably had a really, really great death metal scene. And I've always been kind of fascinated by all these different regional scenes. Like, the first time I heard Entombed, I was like, oh my God, Swedish death metal. What other Swedish death metal bands are there? And, not long after that, finding out about Vader and finding out about Polish death metal. Anytime I can find not just a good band, but all the bands within a scene or within a region, I'll try to track down as many as I can.
Yeah, man. That's the way it used to be. When I used to introduce friends when I was like, growing up as a teen, whatever, it'd be like, you got to hear this Egyptian death metal band called Nile. Yeah, like they're based in South Carolina, but man, that shit's Egyptian death metal. And you'd always kind of classify it like decapitated Polish death metal. And it was always really cool, man, to kind of you could pinpoint it right away, and each area did have their own distinct kind of style or sound, and most of the time it's because they often use like the same like audio engineers, so shit sounded the same, like it was just really cool.
Well, speak to that. Is there something besides the recording that identifies a band as Canadian? I think you use the word frantic.
Well, that's, we get asked that question a lot. People always say, like, there's something up there in Canada. Like, what is it about Canada that breeds all these crazy death metal bands like Cryptopsy and First Fragment and Beyond Creation and all, Gore Guts and all this kind of stuff? Like, what happens? Is it the winter? Is it, everyone's always just trying to figure it out. And, and for us, we say the same thing about like the Bay Area scene or the Polish scene or, anything like that. Like, what's going on over there? And I think for all of us, like, being local musicians, you look up to the more established local musicians or Canadian musicians that have done it before you, right? And you kind of, if you're into music, you're going to music, so you're going to see Canadian bands come around. And for a lot of the older bands that we kind of look up to, I mean, their mentors were bands like Rush, and Journey and things like that were like progressive rock. So that franticness probably comes from the song structures of those kind of proggy bands that really made it. And then for us, like a younger band like Deformatory, looking up to Cryptopsy and Gore Guts, like that becomes what we get used to hearing it, especially hearing in terms of like they're successful, they're established, they're organized, everything's polished, and people like them. So that's what we're exposed to the most, and that becomes essentially the bar that we got to strive to. So I think a lot of it comes from that. Personally, I also, and I talked about this a little bit before, like living up in the northern hemisphere in the wintertime, the sun goes down at 4:30 p.m. and so you wake up and it's dark, you work. And then by the time you're done work, you're back in darkness. And I think there's something that happens psychologically when you're plummeted in darkness for 6 months out of the year for the majority of the time. Whether that creates like a really dark kind of creative energy or whether you're just depressed. Like, I think there's something in that pushes musicians in Canada to be a little bit more creative and maybe tap into something that's beyond the realm of consciousness.
I think the prog connection that you mentioned is really interesting. Like I never consciously put together Rush and Gorguts and Cryptopsy, but it makes sense because when I think of Canadian death metal, it's not just the speed, but there's also an extremely high level of musicianship with the bands. And I don't even know if it's oversimplifying to label all Canadian death metal bands as such, but I really do think of Canadian death metal as being extremely technical, in addition to being extremely fast. Like I don't think of a lot of caveman death metal bands coming from Canada.
they're definitely there, but yeah, they're not up front and center. And sorry, earlier I said Journey and I meant to say Triumph. I always get those two mixed up, but Triumph is like a really good example of a band that when you listen to, they have so many different layers. And if you listen to just one track of Triumph called The Blinding Light Show, it takes you through an entire journey. I forget how long it is. It's like 11 minutes long, 13 minutes long, something like that. And it's a whole journey. It's basically like they were showing everyone, this is all the shit that we could do, right? In one song. Here you go. And if you listen to like a band like Max Webster, like very similar, kind of weird, proggy, experimental. And in one track, it's kind of like a little bit of that. Like, here's all the shit that we could do. And I think that there's something about that because Canada is like so small demographically and in population that to be noticed, to be heard, like you got to kind of push, you got to push the limits a little bit of yourself and your creativity and your musicianship. And sometimes that comes across really well. And I take like a band like First Fragment, for example, right now, like to me personally, I think those guys are probably some of the best musicians that we got going on in our realm of music. They're just absolutely phenomenal. Like every single person that's playing in that band is just pushing the limits to what they can do on their instruments. And I don't know if that's fundamentally a Canadian thing. And just coincidentally, the bands that are actually good and that have made it just coincidentally happen to be doing that same thing. So whether it's coincidence or part of the recipe, who knows?
This journey that you describe, taking the listener on his journey throughout the song, is this something that you consciously try to emulate in Deformatory's music?
More and more so, I would say yes. I think in the beginning, we were just kind of like in the very beginning, we were just like mashing everything. Like, look at what we could do, or look at all the things that we want to do. And we were mashing it in, and it had a semblance of cohesiveness, but it wasn't quite there yet. And now, fast forward to now, where it's definitely more synced up, that now we could focus less on showing or putting or mashing all the musical elements together and more creating the overall story and journey that we want people to follow. And for us, the journey is more than just the music. It's everything. It's the artwork that goes along with it. It's the lyrical concept that goes behind it. For us, we really believe that the final product, like when you have the CD in your hand, that is the key to the musical journey. It's the whole thing. So I think that for us right now is where we're at right now is that, yeah, when we started writing this album, we had the end journey in mind, and we wrote to bring people to, we wrote everything to bring people along that journey with us.
We've gone over this on the blog, but for anyone who hasn't read those interviews, do you want to tell people how Deformatory was formed?
Yeah. So Deformatory came together essentially in 2009, like more or less. And it came together with two members, Jeff and Neil. And Jeff and Neil are childhood friends. So they grew up in Nova Scotia together. They were like, you can find pictures of them in elementary school together, like that kind of stuff. And when they were early teens and after hearing Metallica's like Injustice for All album, they both got instruments. Jeff got a guitar, Neil got a drum set. And so they started jamming together and in Nova Scotia, they joined some grindcore bands and other things like that. So they kind of already had a musical chemistry. And then fast forward to 2009, after years of them moving apart, they both managed to find themselves in Ottawa at the same time and both looking to create something in the extreme metal genre. So Jeff had already pre-written a bunch of again, mashed up songs, right? Just a bunch of ideas. He wanted to add things from Cryptopsy, things from Gorguts, things from Cynic, things from, Mr. Bungle, all that kind of stuff. We want to mash it all together. And so Neil and Jeff started looking for members. And that's kind of where I fell in. I responded to one of those ads looking for another guitar player. I sent them a YouTube video of me playing some deicide. They said, yeah, you seem good enough to do what we're doing. They invited me over for a tryout, and then the kind of rest is history. But it formed in the very beginning with myself, Jeff, Neil, and our vocalist Daryl, who also had really interesting musical interests. He was really into nu metal and really into clean singing kind of stuff. So with all of us in the band at that time, we had 4 people, all of us into death metal, all of us into extreme metal, but we all had very specific things that we were really interested into. So Jeff was more on a progressive creative side. Neil was definitely more on the straightforward black metal approach. I was on the brutal death spectrum more than anything. And Daryl was in clean singing land. Yeah. And we just tried to fuse all of those elements together in the very beginning. And that became what was originally our the beginning of Deformatory, which actually we were called a different name when we started. We were called Tual Masak, which I still don't understand what that means. And after a couple shows of doing it under that and doing that kind of thing, we realized that the name wasn't going to work, and some of the musical elements that we're trying to mash together weren't going to work. So we kind of stripped it down, reconfigured, created the word and the entity of Deformatory, and just refocus our musical approach going forward.
So the last time we did an interview together, Deformatory was a 4-piece, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
And currently you guys, it's you and Neil as a duo.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that?
We were 4 and now we're 2. No, and actually for in the Wicked Pestilence, I think we were a 5-piece. We had 2 guitar players, a bass player. No, you're right. I did vocals as well. So yeah, 4-piece. And we did that for both albums. And after we wrote our second album, Malediction, we started writing immediately. Malediction wasn't even finished being recorded, and we had already written what is essentially the first song on the new album. And it became very clear in the early stages that Neil and I were essentially writing the music, which seemed to be fine. So I think it's important to talk about how we write. So after our first album, or around our first album, every song that we wrote in the jam space. So nothing was ever pre-written. We don't do Guitar Pro. I don't even write tablature. I don't even write out the music. It's like a jam band. Everything comes out really organically, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's musical, sometimes it's definitely not, right? And it waxes and wanes. And I think that after Malediction, and we wrote Malediction in that way, but I think that the members that were in the band couldn't keep up with that, or wasn't comfortable for them to do. So we started seeing some interest kind of waxing and waning there as well. And then our bass player, Justin, who had just recently left the band permanently, ended up committing suicide, unfortunately. And that really kind of hit us kind of hard. And then shortly thereafter, our guitar player, Dan, who had also been our audio engineer for our recordings, he had kind of said, I need a break from a little bit of everything. I got other musical things I want to pursue. And so just kind of by that process of everything, right? The way that we were writing, everyone not being able to contribute to that capacity or in that direction. And in a series of personal events that occurred, it was just Neil and I left. And, you know, at the end of the day, we realized that it was Neil and I to begin with from our first album to now. It was him and I that wrote everything. When we recorded our first album, we didn't do it to click tracks, and it was Neil and I in the studio working on things together. And when we were writing Malediction, it was essentially Neil and I that were spearheading and pushing things forward and moving everything. So after like over a decade of working together, we realized that, you know, we have a really good chemistry and work ethic. And Neil and I are both very similar in terms of our work ethic and things like that. So although it ended up being a duo, we were still accomplishing the same output as we were as a 5-piece when we started, or as a 4-piece for our other 2 albums. So that was a kind of the progression to how things ended up. And now we're trucking along still as a duo, continuing to write every time we meet up. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it worked out.
So let's talk about the new album. It's going to be your third album, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, man.
And it's called Inversion of the Unseen Horizon, and it'll be out on September 3rd. As you mentioned, the band is currently a duo, and you guys wrote the album as a duo. You mentioned the other influences, or the previous band members bringing in their own influences, and those other influences shading Deformatory's sound. With the band reduced to just the two of you, how would you compare the sound or the style of this album to your previous albums?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that it's very comparable in the energy, in the way in which the songs feel when you listen to it. The only thing that I would say is different is that it feels as though the songs were written to be a singular song, in my opinion. So whereas comparing to the very early stuff when we were just starting, it really was just a singular amalgamation, right? Like in the very beginning, like before we recorded anything, and actually the first three songs that we recorded, which are on an EP that we did called The Prelude of, and a single called Believe the Lie, those were songs that were written on fundamentally by only one person, and not everyone was on board with it. So the thing is that at the end of the day, the thing that makes the new tracks or the comparison between old and new is that it's 100% unilateral consensus. We're 100% on board. And when we wrote Malediction, that was also how we did it. So although we jam in the room and we're writing on the spot, when we finished doing a whole section, we ask everyone, when everyone was in the band, is everyone cool with that? Like, is this lame? Is this a weak riff? Is this a good part? Whatever. And if everyone's like, yeah, this is great, then killer, then we move forward. So we really want to make sure when we were writing Malediction that everyone was on board with, and everyone approved every single section. And that approval process, when it was Neil and I, became much easier because we could be much more blunt and direct with each other. We didn't have to worry about hurting each other's feelings. We were both very much on the same page. We had written so many songs or so many parts that we ended up scrapping because we both were not in agreement, or we both, after a while, were like, you know what, not as strong, not as good. And that actually, I think, fundamentally is what makes these songs a lot different and a lot better than the previous stuff, which is there's full agreement. Everyone's on board. Everyone's excited. Everyone's passionate. Everyone is like, feels as though this is the right stuff. Whereas before, we just kind of, everyone basically acquiesced in order to move things forward, right? So they compromise, whether it was their own artistic integrity, their own vision, their own opinions, to not rock the boat, to not upset people, and to just kind of move things along and progress.
Tell me a little bit more about how you and Neil write songs. Do you mostly write in a room together, or do you come up with riffs and forward it to him, and the two of you decide how to arrange them?
I wish I had the time to write riffs at home or anything like that. I'd probably end up being a better guitar player. but no, everything we meet up. So I guess back up, Neil and I meet up every single week, no matter what. You know, no matter how busy we are, you know, how crazy work is, how crazy the weather is. We meet up every single week, and we try to we rehearse the songs that we've already learned or wrote, and then we write something new. How a song gets written, sometimes it could be like something as simple as this. Neil or myself would be like, hey man, I was listening to this new album or this Angel Corpse album, and like they start a song like this, and we pull out our phone, we go to, you know, YouTube or whatever it is, we find the song, and then we try to listen to it, and then we hear how that song either goes or starts, and that usually will ignite an idea. So then we try to replicate or create our own version of that. And then we just jam from there on out. Right. So sometimes it could start like that. Other times, Neil and I will be, for example, rehearsing a song that we had wrote. So like a good example is on track 5 of the album, we write all the songs in sequence to each other, right? So when we finish writing, say, track 4, how we would start the next song writing, we think about what would sound good if we were listening to this album. Like, how would the next song start? How should it sound like? Should it start off slow, fast, with punches and shots, or should it build in? Like, we think about the flow, right? From end to start. So with track 5, because the previous song ends on kind of a bit of a slower note, when we were jamming that song, when it would end, I would just keep riffing. And that's essentially what created the opening riff to track 5 on this album, was just, I didn't want to stop playing guitar. And I would just kind of keep playing. And then Neil would kind of listen to the riff a couple times. He'd chime in. He would start to kind of come up with some beats. And the whole time we have like a Zoom recorder going on in the room. So we're recording what we're doing in those rehearsal moments, in those jams, those spontaneous kind of eruptions of musicality. And if it sounded great, and if we were like in it, and then we were like in the pocket and everything sounded killer, then we'd export that shitty recording and we try and listen back to it the following week and replicate what we did. And that essentially is how we write. We meet up, we jam, we rehearse. Sometimes we write entire songs in one whole sittings, and what you hear on that original demo recording is what you're now hearing on the album. And sometimes it took maybe a couple times to kind of piece it all together and refine some things. Very organic, very natural, and very kind of, for some people, very amateur and very weird. So, and we're cool with all of that.
Was the album completely composed when you guys, or when you added the lyrics?
Yeah, everything except for the bass guitar and some guitar solos. So, you know, obviously there's some like textures and elements that are difficult to do as, you know, just one guitar player in a room with one drummer. But everything from the riffs, the songs, everything were composed well before we hit record. Same thing with the lyrics. So we had everything written, ready to go before anything else. The only instrument that needed to get written was the bass. And I basically just kind of ad-libbed and wrote and recorded the bass at the same time. So there's a lot of parts and stuff that I had ideas for. I could hear in my mind what I wanted the bass to sound like, or I wanted, you know, like some pops, or like maybe an influence. I wanted it to sound like Cryptopsy, or I wanted to sound like the guitar. So I kind of already knew where I wanted it to go, and then I would just kind of come up with it as I was recording. But everything aside from that, even the samples that you hear in some of the songs, those were injected in the demos like after day one, because like we already kind of hear the songs like that. We hear them in their finality.
Talk a little bit about the lyrical concept behind the album, because there's a fairly ambitious concept. I don't know. I don't know another word to explain it, but there's a fairly ambitious concept behind the album, which ties into your previous album, Malediction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's definitely a bit complicated, and yeah, I guess ambitious is the right word for sure. But we've had a theme going and a recurring kind of story from In the Wake of Pestilence, from our very first album. So for every new album, we basically just kind of dove deeper into the story and process of what happened on the previous album. So like on In the Wake of Pestilence, it was basically mankind is completely fed up with religion, organized religion across the world, you know, super original story, and then decide to embark on a mission to destroy, kill, and obliterate anything that has to do with that. And basically, you know, in the end, are looking back at the disease that they managed to eradicate. And then in Malediction, we explored, what finally propelled mankind to get to that point where they were so fed up and hateful of religion that they would go to such lengths to basically scorch the earth. And we explored the possibility that perhaps man was infiltrated by some type of demonic presence. And then we took that a bit deeper and looked at, who or what is that demonic presence? It certainly couldn't be Lucifer as we knew it. It had to be something different. So we looked in Malediction of, could Lucifer, who was in biblical lore an angel that God created, could he have been a possessed angel, right? Was he maybe just like an angelic being that got possessed by a far greater evil? And if so, what is that evil? Like who possessed him? And then so we created this new character called Savael, and this whole kind of story around that original source of dark energy that infiltrated the angel Lucifer, that created what we know as the devil, and then how Savael's reign impacted mankind to create the carnage that occurred in the wake of pestilence, right? So those two kind of tied into each other. And then in this album, Inversion of the Unseen Horizon, we took that story a step further. And, what if Savael, that entity that possessed Lucifer, what if he wasn't the head honcho? Like, what if he wasn't the supreme being? What if he was just a mere droid in this complex hierarchy of intergalactic light consumers? And then so we explored that, and that really kind of branched off into this wild kind of horror sci-fi spin, kind of reminiscent to Hellraiser and all that kind of stuff. And we drew a lot of inspiration from Clive Barker's Scarlet Gospels and all that kind of stuff, and the world in which Pinhead came from, and basically how all of that comes to be. So in Inversion of the Unseen Horizon, we break all of that down. How did this race come to be? What is their mission? How do they terraform or portal into existing worlds? What's their objective, and what's the carnage? So for this album, we had to create a whole world. And we created a planet, we created a hierarchy, we created names and structures and all of this kind of stuff. We really kind of just went to town on the narrative in order to paint a picture that we could write within. So that's essentially where Inversion of the Unseen Horizon is at. We see this as the end chapter to the what started in the wake of pestilence. And there's all sorts of things tied into this album, from like a hidden message or numerology perspective, like even the release date, everything is very calculated. So this is our third album. So we're releasing this album on September 3rd, right? So there's that. It's September, which is the 9th month. There are 9 tracks on this album. 9 is a derivative of 3. The portal in Inversion of the Unseen Horizon, which is called the Zulka, is a triangular portal. A triangle has 3 sides, so there's 3 albums. Like everything is kind of like tied in to a lot of things like that. It's peppered throughout the album. So this is hopefully the end of those concepts and the end of that whole kind of story and saga. And now we could concentrate on some new demented shit.
Do you and Neil write the lyrics together?
No. Neil reviews my lyrics and says, cool, or I don't understand this, but no, I fundamentally write the lyrics and map out the concept. And as long as Neil's on board and he doesn't think it's lame, then I move full steam ahead. Yeah.
So at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about Rush and the possible through line from Rush to Canadian death metal. You know, as you're talking about concept albums, I of course have to think about Rush and a lot of their concept albums. Do you feel strongly about concept albums one way or another?
Well, you know what's funny is that whenever a band releases something and they're promoting it as a concept album, in my mind, I go, what a pretentious sack of shit this person is, or this band is, or, you know, no one's going to read the fucking lyrics. Like, my mind immediately goes there, like as a first primitive thought, you know, if I were to be honest. So I think, like, in my core, the idea of labeling it as a concept album or being a fan of concept albums goes against something inside of me that's kind of ultra resistant to whatever the current stream is. Like, I just have this leaning towards, if you say it's right, I'll say it's left. Like, that's kind of just the way that it is. But I really thoroughly enjoy a well thought out story, and what I love more than anything is bands or artists that put so much into everything that goes behind just the output, like behind the music, like whether it's thinking about an underlying story or current, whether it's certain musical elements or whatever it is. If there's thought and if there's purpose, for whatever reason, that really resonates with me. But please just don't tell me it's a concept album, because I probably won't like it at first. But after a while, once I'm alone and I absorb it myself and I let go of the title of it being a concept album, I tend to really gravitate towards something like that.
I mean, concept albums are so divisive. Like, people either love them or hate them. I personally, you know, one of the cudgels used against metal bands is people from the more punk side of things will be like, well, I don't like fantasy, I like reality or whatever. And my response is usually, well, I like well thought out lyrics, I don't like empty sloganeering, especially if they're ultimately insincere. Do you know what I mean? And so as far as concept albums go, and you know, this goes back to being like 13 and getting Seventh Son of the Seventh Son, where there was a whole world that you stepped into. You know, we talked about the journey, and you know, the journey starts with the album artwork and the song titles, and every song being a different chapter in the story. And with a lot of those 70s and 80s concept albums, the concept wasn't literally spelled out for you, but you got a sense of what the story would be, which is what a lot of, you know, humankind's earliest stories were. You know, there were poems, there were songs, there were tales that were told and passed from one person to another, or from one generation to another. And so I think it's intrinsic to our that word again, journey. It's intrinsic to our journey as humans to want to tell each other stories. And I don't think, you know, I'm sure the earliest Homo sapiens had political leaders that they wanted to write songs about and yell, you know, fuck that guy. But I also think the other impulse is equally part of our nature to want to craft a story and bring other people into that journey.
You know, I think you're onto something. I think that there's a fundamental human element there. Like, you could look at like petroglyphs in caves and things like that. And some people say, you know what, they were just painting or drawing what they saw. There's a giraffe, there's a star, and there's a plant, and they're just, you know, there's no meaning behind that. They're just literally so primitive that they're just literally drawing what they see. That's it. But you have no idea what was going through in their mind and in that moment. Like, perhaps it could be something as simple as a depiction of what they saw. Perhaps that's how they were trying to communicate a deeper story or meaning or instructions, or maybe they were just fucking with someone. Like, you never know the true intent behind some of those things. And I always found that very interesting. I always found that even though I don't perhaps subscribe to a lot of the the beliefs, but the idea that religion was probably just misidentified extraterrestrials and spacecrafts. Like I always really thought that was really interesting. And there's like this really interesting notion that people in biblical times, like they couldn't describe a flying craft. They couldn't describe that kind of stuff. So they likened it to gods and angels coming down from the sky. And I always found that notion very interesting, that what you see is not always what you get, or you're not always fully aware of the true nature or story behind it. And when you look at even something that we've done, and again, on the scale of things, our stuff is still very basic. But our first album, In the Wake of Pestilence, it has this very interesting story behind it. And it's, basic, and it's really at its core just an angry concept. But the underlying thing behind all of that is I was going through a number of things at that time, one of which was a divorce, one of which was going through a change in my career. And I worked as a counselor in a drug treatment facility that was Christ-centered, where the founder of that place was a self-proclaimed prophet who would, if you as a staff member said you were sick, he would say, well, let me pray for you. There was no time off. And I worked in that environment for like 9 years. And so when I resigned and finally had enough of that, the whole overarching story that people are reading and that we kind of talk about up front about In the Wake of Pestilence is really just scratching the surface of what actually I'm trying to say, which is I'm trying to get a bunch of shit out there and off my mind and out into the universe so I can move on with my life. But those aren't the things that we're going to talk about. No one wants to spend the time to listen to all that stuff. So in our lyrics, including in some of the things that we did in Malediction, there's double meanings. And certain choices of words or the way that things are structured may mean two different things to me based on what I'm writing. And so I always find, whether it's us, whether it's Rush, whether it's someone else, that if the art or the artist behind the art has purpose, I'm automatically appreciative and I'm drawn to that. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea to think about.
Now, is the concept behind, or the concept in Inversion of the Unseen Horizon, told from a particular perspective? Do you have a character that you follow through the
yeah
album?
So really great question. So the album itself is broken up into 3 chapters, again that number 3 to signify the end of the 3rd album and all that stuff, and each chapter is written from a different perspective. So from chapter 1, it's basically like an omniscient perspective, where the chapter speaks about the creation of Seruxal, which is that planetary life form. And so everything about how that came to be, how the multiverse came to be, all that kind of stuff, and how the first life form created a horde of these droids and all that kind of stuff. So chapter 1 is from that perspective. Chapter 2 is written from the perspective of the grand architect, the first life force, the person who is in charge of this planetary life, whose sole mission is to devour light and life throughout the cosmos. So the second chapter is written from his perspective as he executes his plan for interdimensional domination. Okay. And then the third chapter is written from the perspective of a world or a planet being invaded. So it's basically written from the perspective of their eyes seeing this portal come through and completely turn the world upside down without them knowing what hit them, sort of like what we've been going through the last 2 years because of the pandemic. So, it's written from 3 different perspectives.
Tell me a little bit about the recording of this album. Where did you guys end up going?
So for this one, we actually went with a guy called Topon Dawes, who is the main dude in a band called Fuck the Facts, like a grindcore band here in Canada that are quite popular, and at least in their scene, it could only be so popular in grindcore. But they're legit. They've been around for like, I don't know, like 60 years. No, that's a joke. But like they've been around for a very long time. And Topon is an incredible, incredible musician, but he's also an incredible sound engineer as well. And so he has his own studio called Apartment 2 Recording. And so we partnered up with him to basically record the drums at his studio and then reamp all of the guitars at his place. And then he did the mixing, the mastering, all that kind of stuff. And then we had a guest solo as well. So that got recorded at his place. So yeah, so we got Topon from a Fuck the Facts / Apartment 2 Recording to handle all of that fun stuff.
So we'll get to the guests in just a minute, but what is guitar reamping? What does that entail?
So these are all things that I had to learn on this album as well. I had no real idea. I'm not that savvy. And we had the benefit, like before Neil and I became a duo, we had another guitar player called Dan Rogers. He was with us on Malediction, but he had recorded In the Wake of Pestilence. He had recorded Malediction and a couple other singles. So he was our audio engineer. He just happened to be in the band. So any of that kind of stuff, like it went to him. So we never had to deal with it. So we learned a lot during this recording process, because when the pandemic hit, lockdowns hit. So instead of recording guitars in the studio, I learned how to record at home. And typically what happens is you record at home and you record what's called a DI, or direct impulse, like a clean signal. And that signal that you're recording from your guitar can then be sent back to a real amplifier and re-recorded, or basically the sound, the tone coming out of the amplifier, the signal, the clean signal converts into the amplified sound coming out. So what was cool is that I was able to record all the guitar tracks at home and essentially just send Topon the clean signal, the DI, and he was then able to then send that direct signal to an amplifier coming out of a guitar cab, where it got captured by a microphone and then re-recorded. So we were able to get the sound of real amps again, even though the signal was a digital signal. In essence, that's what reamping is. I probably butchered that explanation, and some audio files are probably screaming at the top of their decibels, but that in essence is how I understand reamping to be.
Why Topon? Why did you choose to work with him?
Couple reasons. Roughly the same age, or a bit older, so there was something about that appealed to us. Sonically, what he was producing and what he produces for Fuck the Facts was in line with what we wanted. We wanted this album to sound like real instruments this time. So we wanted something that didn't sound overproduced, that didn't sound like what you would hear anything like everyone else sounding like. We wanted a real sounding album, because at the end of the day, Neil and I play in a rehearsal space with my amp cranked way louder than it should, with drums full blast going a million miles an hour. And that's what we love. Like that's what draws us to keep meeting up week after week. It's what that volume and that intensity creates. It's our outlet. It's our output. So we wanted someone that could capture that and that understood that. And we felt that Topon really understood this, because, he's a DIY guy through and through. He's recorded all of his stuff. He's recorded tons of other bands at the same time. And he really understands that kind of that feel that we were going for. And having worked with Topon just on the local scene, so he was like a sound guy for one of the local metal bars or bars in Ottawa that let metal bands like us play. Whenever he would do the sound, it sounded great. Like it's some of the only shows that we had that we'd never complain about the sound or the sound guy, because he knew, like, because he played in bands, he toured, he did all this stuff. He really knew this stuff inside and out. So we immediately had this sense of comfort that he wouldn't turn down what we were trying to go for, which is we wanted to record the album without click tracks, like we did on In the Wake of Pestilence. There's no metronome. It was live off the floor. but we wanted it to sound live off the floor from an energy perspective, but we wanted to sound like it came from a properly recorded production. Like, sometimes live or raw or organic, like sounds like shit. And we didn't want that. We wanted it sonically to sound balanced and good. We wanted it to sound real, but we wanted it to sound like us. And to be honest, we knew from the very beginning that Topon would be able to do that without problem. And we're really, really happy with how everything turned out. He's like the chillest guy to work with. He knows the stuff inside out. There's no pressure. There's no rush. There's no nothing that impacted us in a negative way. Just everything. He was a consummate professional through and through.
Now, with you handling the vocals and all the instruments besides the drums, did you feel additional pressure? Not really. I can't, like, maybe I should take a look at that and see why I haven't. But no, I never see any of that kind of stuff as being a burden or feeling the pressure to perform and deliver, because I'm at the end of the day, I'm ultra passionate about this. And no matter how many hours I'll work in a day, like I work in order to play music. I work in order to make sure everything else is paid, family is paid for, kid is fed, everything is done so that I could concentrate on doing what I love. Because like at the end of the day, I love music. I love death metal. I love doing what we're doing. So for me, I never see any of this kind of stuff as being problematic. And even in the recording process, like if a lot of it fell on me to meet those goals and expectations, I was happy with it because I would gladly spend 30 hours a day writing and recording music if that's what was needed, what needed to happen. Tell me about the guests that you have on the album and what their contributions were.
Yeah, so we have John Levasseur, who is, for me, one of my favorite guitar players of all time. And for Neil and I, the guitar player of our favorite band, like the band that we love and look up to probably the most, a band called Cryptopsy. So John was the guitar player that basically wrote None So Vile, which is like every one of us are the Bible for brutal death metal. And he was the guitar player in Whisper Supremacy, wrote all of that crazy stuff. And John is, for us, the true genius behind what made Cryptopsy. Like John and Flo, their chemistry, their creation, their riffs. I know a lot of people love Lord Worm and all that's great and that stuff, but at the end of the day, the musicality came from John Levasseur and Flo Mounier, the drummer. So we actually have a song called Impaled Upon the Carrion Spire, where the opening riff is more or less ripped off. It was probably one of those sessions where, like, you know what, how we should start a song? It should start off something like this. And we labeled it as a Cryptopsy riff, but we never could place the song because, to be honest, it could sound like any Cryptopsy riff. But that's how we kind of like labeled it. And we knew that we wanted a solo to start pretty much out of the gate, like within the first 20 seconds of the song. And to be honest, we actually reached out and we had a couple other people send us a guest solo. So we had like Alex Bailey from Cognizance do a guitar solo over that opening section. And we were really appreciative and like it was really cool. We love Cognizance. Alex is like a crazy guitar player, but you know what? Like when we were listening back to the solo, we're like, fuck, it's not it. It's just like, and unfortunately, again, it was a very unorthodox style because he was asking for like a tempo map and the click track and, is it to the grid? And all those things are not how we write and not how we even recorded the album. We could barely even tell him what key it is. Like, we're not those kind of musicians. And, at the end of the day, Neil and I talked about this would be a perfect section for John to do a solo in, but we had no idea how to get a hold of him. John is notorious for kind of like disappearing into the darkness. He disappeared, he left Cryptopsy after Whisper Supremacy, more or less, or whatever. And then came back in 2012 to write the self-titled Cryptopsy album to bring them back up to everyone's standards after The Unspoken King. And then he disappeared back into the darkness again. And like, no one's heard from him. He's not on social media. He's not that kind of guy. And so we had to even reach out to Flo and other people in Cryptopsy and said, hey, do you happen to have like John's number? And everyone was really respectful. They're like, I don't think he's going to go for that, or, we don't want to bother him with that. So we ended up finding someone that claimed to be John on some forum online. And it was like an archive post from around 2012. Nothing posted after, very little posted before. So I kind of sent a message and just said, hey, not too sure if you're actually John Levasseur, but we're with this band. We love you guys, all this kind of stuff. Here's a song that, I sent him one of our demos for that track. I said, we would love if you could write a solo over this part and contribute in this way. Never expecting anything from that. Just sent it out into the ether and just kind of, I was already working on writing a solo for that part. So we just kind of resolved that wasn't going to happen. But sure enough, man, like in less than 2 weeks, someone replied back claiming to be John. He seemed to be really enthusiastic about the track, and COVID had just really started to hit hard. So he said that he was totally down and that he would come up with something and he'd come up to Ottawa when restrictions would lift and he would record this part. And so sure enough, he came up and we still had no idea if it was actually going to be him. Again, all the conversations were happening via text and stuff like that. And he showed up at Topon's studio and he didn't have long hair anymore. He was wearing a mask, and we thought we had been catfish. Like, we honestly thought, to be honest, we thought like, okay, maybe this guy's name is actually John Levasseur. Like, he's not lying about that. Maybe he plays guitar, but Like, is it the guy? You know what I mean? Like, is it None So Vile John? And as soon as he pulled out his iconic Fender guitar out of the case, and as soon as he started playing, like he ripped that solo in one take, we knew right away it was the same guy. And we spent about 30 minutes on the recording and about 4 hours talking about music. So we knew we had the right guy. And what was really cool is that although he, was really just asked to write that intro solo, he loved the track so much that he wrote like another lead part that happens later on in the song. And then a few weeks after the recording session, he reached out to me and said, you know what, Charlie, I don't want to make this suggestion, but I wrote a classical guitar part that I think would go really well at the very beginning of the song because it ties in to what I do at the end. Again, John is he's a musician through and through, right? And he's so creative. And for us, we were sitting back, we're like, can you fucking believe this? Like, this guy, like, it blew our mind. Like, I was still like, even just trying to like articulate it is difficult because we're going back to our conversation at the beginning, like looking up at musicians that propelled us and that encouraged us to do what we do now and to write the music that we do and perform. Like, John for me is that guitar player. In fact, when you look at pictures of me playing in Deformatory in the very beginning, even on In the Wake of Pestilence, the guitar that I use is like it became embedded into our fabric as musicians. So to have this guy not only write a solo, which in itself was already throwing us like for fangirl loops like you would not believe, but to also love the song so much that he wanted to jam on it, wanted to create more stuff, and was genuinely into what we were doing and gave us basically the seal of approval for that track, was truly humbling and such a great experience. And it happened very haphazardly, and we weren't sure if we were being taken for a ride in the beginning. So yeah, very interesting story.
That's awesome. In addition to John Levasseur, I understand you also had a guest vocalist perform some vocals on Summoning the Cosmic Devourer.
Yeah, I did. In the lyric book, he's mysteriously called MPL. And MPL stands for Mason Peter Leduc, which is my son's name. And my son was only about 6 weeks old at the time. And he was, as any 6-week-old was, crying whenever he wanted to be changed or have food. And his cries were crazy.
6 weeks old and already an accomplished screamer.
Oh, he's better than me. And honestly, his cries were nuts sounding. Like, it sounded really wild. So I said, you know what? I'm gonna capture this little motherfucker, and I'm gonna pitch shift this stuff. I'm gonna reverse this stuff. And so there's this part in Summoning the Cosmic Devourer that opens up a little bit, and we really wanted to create this tense atmosphere. And so we injected Little Mason's screams and cries there, and so he's our extra guest vocalist.
So you're self-releasing this album. Have you self-released everything up to this point?
No. So after In the Wake of Pestilence, we signed up with CDN Records for like a distribution deal, and they released Malediction, our second album. And they were behind 2 singles that we did, one called Myosis, which was a split with another label, a band called Blood of Christ. And we kind of released a 7-inch vinyl with them. And then another single, just a cover of Deicide's Once Upon the Cross. So all those releases were on CDN Records. And in fact, we had a contract with them for this album as well. So they were going to be the label behind Inversion of the Unseen Horizon. Yeah, so we kind of switched that up and decided to release it independently.
Any particular reason?
Tons of. No.
Do you prefer to?
Oh no, man! There's nothing that I'm not willing to talk about. Like we're an underground. Like 5 people know who we are. I don't care. I'll talk about anything. But no. It goes back to what we were talking about for a good portion of this. Like we, from the very beginning, Neil and I had a very distinct artistic vision for what we wanted to accomplish with this album. Both of us said, if this is our last album, what are all the things that we want to check off the list that we haven't done yet, from like a marketing perspective, packaging perspective, merch perspective, imagery, all this kind of stuff. And there was a lot of things like just from that aspect, music, concept, and lyrics aside, there was a whole other dimension to our artistic vision, which involved putting something on vinyl, getting a digipack, something that we wanted the whole artwork to be enveloped into what we did. And of course, some of the outputs like videos and music videos and this kind of stuff. And to be honest, CDN Records, they're just a budget label. Craig, the guy who runs that label, he's a nice enough guy. He would never did us wrong by any means, but at the end of the day, they're not interested in that kind of stuff. So we unfortunately did not see eye to eye on that. And we weren't willing to compromise at the end of the day, our artistic vision. We had also made some decisions about us not wanting to go on streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music, just out of basic principles for respect towards the artists and some fundamental belief systems that we have around that. And those are all things that we were not willing to give up on. And so there's that. And then there's something that Neil and I kind of decided on, that sometimes if you're part of a label, you kind of get associated with the rest of the roster. You know what I mean? Like on that label, like at the end of the day, that's what a label is. It's like a group of people together. And some labels have very distinct styles or visions for what they want to do. And we started just growing increasingly weary of the fact that CDN, like every week, was offering 70% discounts on older stock, like constantly just trying to get people to buy shit at discounted rates. And, it made us feel like we were part of like a thrift store label. You know what I mean? Like we were just part of a label that was constantly discounting shit. And to be honest, we didn't feel that we wanted to be associated with that. We valued what we were doing a little bit more. We valued the time, effort, and energy that we put in. Neil and I are, from a professional perspective, our time, our billable time is quite expensive. Our hourly rates are quite expensive. So from like a business world, we personally value ourselves a little bit differently. And it's not to say that the bands on that label are budget by any means. And that's the problem, is that the bands on that label are so fucking good. Some of them are even local and are friends, and we know the kind of effort that goes into it. And sometimes I think that the fact that you're on a label doesn't always mean that much. And just take a look at Cryptopsy. Like they decided to do that as well. Like just another example, like they were signed to Century Media for Whisper Supremacy, and they're, following on, like that's a big label. Like they had made it. But they're self-titled. You know what they did? They said, fuck everything. Fuck the labels. Fuck this. Fuck that. We're releasing it ourselves because we want to be in full control of the output and in full control of the return. And there's something really admirable about a band that's willing to do that and take whatever hits may come. And to be honest, Adrian, for us, we're an underground band that's financed everything ourselves without any expectation that we would sell a single thing or make anything back. It's a labor of love. We do it because we love the music, and we do it because we both want to see the final output. So I think at the end of the day, all of those things together really kind of pushed us to say, you know what, independent is the way to go for us on this album.
I mean, this is something that comes up from time to time on the podcast, where I'll ask bands why they need the label, why they want it to be on the label. And my personal feeling is, and maybe my sense of history is a little bit off, but my personal feeling is that a label was necessary during a period of time where, the label had the ability to buy ads in magazines. There was no, or very little, ability for bands and artists to communicate directly to their audience, when the means of distribution was locked up in physical releases, which are expensive to produce. And so everything relied on capital. Finding somebody with the capital and the ability to invest in what you did. And I think in the last 20 years, that paradigm has essentially crumbled. So there's still bands who want to put out vinyl and don't have the capital to put out vinyl. And in those cases, yeah, a label is essential. And I have talked to a few bands who are like, you know, we just want to focus on our music. We don't want to deal with all the marketing and that side of it. We'd rather have a professional do that. And fair enough. Like, even as somebody who is just running a little podcast and a little blog, constantly posting stuff on social media is irritating and not much fun. And so I can see wanting to get someone else to handle that side of it.
Of course, yeah.
But I really think the power has shifted dramatically from the label to the artist, to the point where you see these huge companies like Sony buying up companies like Century Media. And the reason why all the great bands that are on Century Media, whether it's Napalm Death or Grave or Unleashed or whoever, or even old Cryptopsy, these bands never sold more than tens of thousands of records. You know what I mean? These aren't gold or platinum selling artists. And everything in this particular period of time, everything has come down to streaming rights and libraries, and having a library of content that you can license to a streaming company. And so for a band that's been around for 10 years, that has 4 or 5 up to 10 albums or however many, that's a library of content that's valuable to a label, even if the band itself isn't able to sell a lot of physical copies. I mean, a lot of the bands that I talk to, even on recognizable labels, are basically printing up like 500 or 1,000 CDs just because people aren't buying CDs anymore. It's all about the streaming rights. So I really question whether labels are necessary, especially in a genre as niche as metal or death metal. Like, I really think that bands should strive harder to take their future in their own hands and not rely on labels as much. I don't know. No. Right now, all the PR people who send me promos are quickly cutting me off.
No, you make a lot of good points, man, and I think we see eye to eye there a lot, and it's a bit of a catch-22, because like, as much as Neil and I are dedicated to the final output, we also, like, we're not just doing this for ourselves. Otherwise, why go through the effort of releasing it to people? We would just keep shit in a vault at a rehearsal space and like meet up every Sunday and listen to it together, and that's it. If it was just for us, like, obviously we want other people to hopefully get into it, maybe get inspired by it, maybe just bang their heads, like whatever, or maybe even just hate it. Like, that too is also really cool. Like, we know that what we do, even in death metal, is not for everyone. Like, the style is not for everyone. We get that. But the catch is that we, at our core, we want as many people as possible to listen to it. Like, it would be great if people got to hear what comes out of Ottawa and in Canada, and maybe if there's just one track or one thing that inspires another band, just like how Cryptopsy or Gorguts inspired us in the beginning. Again, it's been a really great journey this last decade, writing music for Deformatory, something that got sparked by another band, right? I got influenced by another band. So we would want that obviously to happen as well, and hopefully maybe be a small part of that artist's journey. So the interesting thing is that, like, a label, like, you take someone like a label like Season of Mist or Unique Leader, some of those labels that are more kind of in line with what we do. What they have more than anything is a reach, like, or at least the appearance of a reach, right? And so then, you have, like, if you go on like their Facebook page, you have like, over 200,000 people that like their stuff versus like our 4,000, right? So it's like, and we also know that, like, out of that 4,000, like, more than half of them probably don't really exist anymore. or don't see our stuff or whatever. So what a label can do is provide, hopefully, that reach to people. And so there, to us, we're not anti-label. We were just anti that fucking label for a couple of reasons. But yeah, man, it's really, you're absolutely right. Everything's shifting to kind of the digital platform, streaming, all that kind of stuff. It's been shifting for a while. It's been really cool to see that right now vinyl is like the new thing that people are collecting. And that's why like all the vinyls have these crazy variants and splatter effects and all that stuff. And again, it's all, finding a way people to own something of the band as something that they could hold on to and collect. I think that that's really cool. And what a lot of these labels are able to do is, like you said, provide that capital to kind of get that output out, while at the same time having the ability to broadcast to a wider audience, even if it's just streaming. And so, yeah, so I think for us, like we're very happy that we're doing it this way. We went ahead and did all the things that, we think that you should do. Like we hired a PR guy, something we didn't do before. And we hired a company to handle our social media accounts because we couldn't care less about social media and we don't do well. So we hired people that had and do all that bullshit for us. But for us, at the end of the day, what we really want is the people who are into this music to hopefully check us out and dig it enough that they share it with someone else. So yeah, I think that labels can help with that for the right group of people. And so for us, a little bit of that would be nice to have. But then there's the other part of us that's like a part of our core, which is like, bands that are popular and trendy on labels, fuck them. They're like the jocks of high school. It's great that they could do all this great stuff, and it's great that they're popular, but at the end of the day, we're like musical loners, and there's something comfortable about that as well. And we're also really cool with that happening at the same time.
Inversion of the Unseen Horizon is the name of the third Deformatory album, and it'll be out on September 3rd of this year. Charlie, what's the best way to get this album?
Just go to deformatory.ca and that'll redirect you to our Bandcamp page, which is where we're putting everything. So our digital album, CD, vinyl, cassette tape, and all of the other merchandise like t-shirts, flags, that kind of stuff, it's all up on our Bandcamp page. That's the only platform, only site that we have things up for sale and where you could get the whole.
Do you want to say anything about the limited edition vinyl versions that you have coming out?
Yeah, I could say that it's limited because it's damn expensive to press on your own. That's where we need some of that goddamn label capital to help us out. But no, yeah, so it's limited. It's limited to, I think it's 100 we did for this one. It's a really cool blue and black marbled kind of effect. The vinyl itself turned out really great. We got it pressed by a company that's based here in Canada called Precision Disc Pressing or Recordings. I forget what they're called. Excellent company to deal with. But yeah, vinyl is expensive to press, man. So really expensive, something that we did not know, but we had already committed to doing. So yeah, so it's limited to 100 copies for now. And once they're gone, they're gone. We don't know if we're going to repress them. Expensive
to press. And also there are only a few companies that do large batches of vinyl, right? Like I remember talking to someone who said that their album was delayed because I think it was Beyonce. Beyonce decided to do a vinyl album, and there's only one pressing plant, and so all the manufacturing and all the manufacturing and printing for vinyl records was delayed by 3 or 4 months because of this one Beyonce album.
It's really crazy. Even for us, we got in right at like a pretty decent time, but it still took like well over 14 or 16 weeks, even just for 100 to get done. And it's becoming increasingly popular. So even the smaller pressing plants, they're rammed. Like they're it's taken quite a while for things to get out, which is really interesting. But yeah, it is pricey, and with good reason. And the price goes up the more things you add into it, like all those splatter effects and things like that. All that stuff adds up. Like our vinyls at cost are like $25 each that we paid to get them pressed. So it's like, and then you can't sell them at like $100 to like make a profit. You have to be reasonable. So yeah, so definitely we're totally cool with that. It's a labor of love. We were happy to get vinyls for ourselves. Like we were willing to spend like over $2,000 just to get it for ourselves to have one copy each. That's how much it meant to us. So we're just happy that people are buying it and people are digging it and that it's available for people who want it, which is great.
So we actually didn't talk about this, but do you want to say anything about the artwork for the album?
Oh shit, yeah. The real quick, I know I'm long-winded. I apologize. The artwork for this album we got done by an artist called Paul Gerard. Not on everyone's like radar for metal album covers, but he's an exceptional artist. He's actually a movie concept designer. And this album for us, the theme is heavily inspired by some of Clive Barker's stuff and Hellraiser stuff. And a while back, I don't know if you are into horror or whatever, but a while back there was a trailer that got released on YouTube to basically do like a Hellraiser Origins movie. It was like, it was going to be like this making of the Pinhead story. And it was actually really cool. Got everyone really excited, especially us in the band who are all like Hellraiser fans. Turns out that was just like that trailer was just like a trailer for to pitch to get the movie funded, which unfortunately never happened. But the concept designer behind that, the person who's behind all of the artistic elements and all of the creative design is Paul Gerard. In fact, Paul Gerard's also the guy behind like the Hellboy movies, the concept design for him, the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like the character designs, Wrath of the Titans, all sorts of cool shit. He's an exceptional artist. And so we just managed to connect with him. He was in between movies, had some free time, and really dug our brief, what we wanted him to do, which was crazy. And so, yeah, so Paul Gerard did the design work and obviously nailed exactly what we wanted. And it's just an insane artist to work with. It was really cool.
That's awesome. Now, if people want to follow Deformatory online and keep up to date with what you guys are doing, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so we're on all of the garbage platforms that you could find us on. So Facebook, we're there. So facebook.com/deformatory if you're typing it into a browser somehow. Same thing with Instagram, we're there. YouTube, we're putting all of our videos and stuff up on YouTube, so it's there. Those are the three main platforms that you could find us on, and of course our Bandcamp page, so deformatory.bandcamp.com. Or if you can't remember that, just go deformatory.ca. CA stands for Canada. Super simple.
What can you tell me about the EP that you're recording in October?
Well, what do you want to know?
Well, how much information can you give me? Is it a continuation of the same concept? How many songs is it going to be?
Okay. Yeah. So definitely not a continuation of the concept. The Inversion is the final chapter of that series of concepts. So that's done. Moving on to a different thing. So this album's already mapped out. Like this EP is already mapped out. Like it's not really concept. It's a theme. The EP is going to be called Harbinger, and more or less, I think it's what's been called. And each song is basically a different aspect of what we've been living through in the pandemic, from different perspectives, whether it's our perception of control, whether it's deaths that could have been prevented, whether it's all sorts of things. So it's going to be more of like a socio-political take on what we've all been living through, but with a definitely like a horror macabre filter layered on top. So very angry album. The EP, the music itself, 4 tracks, and it's just very angry. But at the same time, the music itself, a very good continuation of what we did on Inversion of the Unseen Horizon, with just a little bit more twists and turns, things that we haven't done before. And yeah, just intense, just typical deformatory nonsense. Yeah.
Very cool. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much, Charlie.
Thank you, Adrian. Have a good rest of your, I guess, morning now.
I'm not dead.